The stagecoach rattled to a stop at the edge of Willow Creek, its wheels crunching against the frozen ground, a thin layer of snow dusting the rutted road. Eliza stepped down, her worn boots sinking into the cold, the hem of her faded gray dress brushing against the icy crust. In her hands, she clutched a small satchel, the only remnant of a life left behind, its leather cracked and weathered. The town loomed before her, low, weathered buildings huddled against the wind, smoke drifting lazily from chimneys, and the faint murmur of voices carried on the sharp air. She'd come with a fragile hope, a letter from a former employer promising a position as a seamstress, a chance to bury the shame that clung to her like the scent of ash. But the letter had gone unanswered, and the coldness of this place seeped into her bones. A woman emerged from the boarding house, her apron stained with flour, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Eliza. "You, the seamstress?" she asked, her tone flat, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Eliza nodded, her fingers tightening on the satchel. "Name's Mrs. Hargrove. Heard you were cumin." The woman's gaze flicked to Eliza's barren midsection, then back to her face, a flicker of judgment passing through her eyes. "Folks here don't take kindly to your sort. Barren women ain't got much use in a town needing hands to raise the next generation. Best you move on." The words cut deep, though delivered with the indifference of routine. Around her, the town seemed to turn. A weighman unloading crates at the mercantile glanced sidelong, their lips curling. A group of women by the well fell silent, their whispers replaced by the creak of the wind. Eliza's chest tightened, the weight of her past pressing down, whispers in Charleston of her failure. The husband who'd cast her out, the label of not enough that followed her here. The wind tugged at her shawl, its coarse thread scratching against her neck, and she adjusted it, her hands trembling slightly. The cold bit at her cheeks, and she turned her face from the stairs, her resolve hardening like the frost beneath. Her feet, across the street, a lone figure stood near the blacksmith's forge, a tall man with dark hair tied back, his coat dusted with snow. His Apache features were stoic, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. No pity, no scorn. Then he turned, vanishing into the gray, leaving her with the chill and the echo of a town that had already judged her. Eliza trudged through the snow, the weight of the satchel pulling at her shoulder, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The boarding house door had slammed shut behind her. Mrs. Hargrove's parting words, "No charity for the unwanted," ringing in her ears. She found refuge in a lean-to behind the livery stable, its sagging roof offering scant protection from the wind that howled through the gaps. The scent of hay and horse lingered, mingling with the damp chill that seeped into her bones. She spread her shawl on the ground, laying out a thin blanket for warmth, and settled Elias against her chest, his soft breaths a fragile anchor in the silence. The town felt like a foreign land, its streets empty save for the occasional clatter of hooves or the distant bark of a dog. The cold pressed against her, a constant reminder of her isolation. Her fingers, stiff from the journey, fumbled with the satchel's clasp, retrieving a crust of bread she'd saved. She broke it into pieces, feeding Elias first, the dry crumbs catching in her throat as she swallowed. The judgment of Willow Creek lingered like a shadow, whispers of her barrenness, the stain of a past she couldn't erase. Yet beneath the ache, a quiet resolve flickered. She wouldn't beg, wouldn't crumble. The shawl's coarse threads scratched against her skin as she adjusted it, a small act of control in a world that sought to strip her dignity. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a hammer striking iron, a rhythmic pulse from the blacksmith's forge. She glanced toward it, remembering the man with the dark hair, his steady gaze. He'd offered no words, no help, but his presence had been a contrast to the town's coldness, silent witness to her arrival. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the task ahead. With trembling hands, she began to mend a tear in her skirt. The needles bite a familiar comfort. The thread gleamed faintly in the dim light, a symbol of her determination to stitch together a new life. Night fell, the lean-to darkening as the wind grew sharper. Elias stirred, his tiny fist clutching her finger, and she hummed a lullaby, her voice soft against the storm. The world was unwelcoming, but her resolve held, a quiet flame against the winter's grip. The dawn broke over Willow Creek with a pale, watery light, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Eliza rose from the lean-to, her joints stiff from the cold, the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and the faint tang of wood smoke, a reminder of the life stirring beyond her makeshift shelter. With Elias nestled against her chest, she ventured into the town, her boots crunching softly on the frozen path. She had no plan, only the need to survive, and her hands calloused from years of needlework hitched for purpose. The general store loomed ahead, its windows fogged with warmth, and she stepped inside. The bell above the door jingling faintly. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of dried goods and leather, shelves lined with sacks of flour and bolts of fabric. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a perpetual frown, barely glanced at her as she approached. "Need work," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. He grunted, eyeing her worn dress and the baby in her arms. Ain't much call for seamstresses here, folks mend their own." His words carried the weight of judgment, and she felt the stares of two women browsing nearby, their whispers like a rustle of dry leaves. Yet, she didn't flinch. "I'll take any job mending, baking, cleaning," she added, her chin lifting slightly. Reluctantly, he handed her a pile of torn shirts and a basket of thread, muttering about a dime apiece. It wasn't charity, she told herself, just trade. Back in the lean-to, she set to work, the needle slipping through fabric with practiced ease. The rhythm, a quiet defiance against the town's scorn. The thread gleamed in the dim light, a thread of her own making, symbolizing her refusal to break. Elias cooed softly, his tiny hands reaching for the fabric, and she smiled, a rare warmth spreading through her. Days passed, and the townsfolk's glances grew colder, their murmurs sharper. Barren and alone, she overheard at the well, the words slicing through her resolve. But she pressed on, trading mended clothes for a loaf of bread, her hands steady as she kneaded dough in the livery stable's corner. The wind howled outside, winter's grip unrelenting, yet within her, a quiet strength bloomed, rooted in the simple act of surviving. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting a golden hue over Willow Creek, the snow softening under its weak warmth. Eliza sat outside the lean-to, her fingers deftly threading a needle through a worn shirt, the fabric cool against her skin. Elias slept in a makeshift cradle of blankets, his soft breaths mingling with the rustle of pine needles in the breeze. The town's rhythm had settled into a quiet hum. Hooves on the road, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and she'd grown accustomed to its edges, its cold indifference. Her hands moved with purpose, the thread a lifeline. Though the weight of judgment still lingered in the air, a shadow fell across her work, and she looked up to find the man from the forge standing nearby. His dark hair was tied back, his coat dusted with ash, and his eyes, deep and unreadable, met hers without flinching. He carried a small bundle, wrapped in burlap, and set it down beside her with a quiet nod. "Saw you mendin'," he said, his voice low, carrying the cadence of the Apache tongue beneath the English. "Thought you might need this." Inside was a length of sturdy cloth, clean and unblemished, a silent offering. No pity colored his words, no curiosity about her past, just a steady gaze that seemed to see her as she was. Eliza's fingers paused, the needle still, as she studied him. His name, she'd learned from a passing trader, was Tahoma, a widower who kept to himself. The town whispered of his solitude, his Apache heritage marking him as an outsider much like her. Yet there was no judgment in his stance, only a quiet respect that unsettled her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above the wind, and he inclined his head, turning to leave. But he paused, glancing back at Elias. "He's strong," he said simply, then walked away, his boots leaving faint prints in the snow. The cloth lay beside her, its texture rough yet warm, and she ran her fingers over it, a small warmth spreading through her chest. The townsfolk's stares still burned, their whispers of barren and unwanted echoing, but Tahoma's gesture felt like a crack in the ice. She resumed her sewing, the rhythm steady, the cloth now a symbol of something new, a connection forged, not in words, but in silence and shared resilience. The wind carried the scent of pine, and for the first time, the cold felt less absolute. The spring thaw crept into Willow Creek, softening the snow into muddy rivulets that traced the dirt paths. Eliza stood outside the lean-to, her hands busy with a basket of mending, the air carrying the fresh scent of melting ice and budding sage. Elias toddled nearby, his small boots leaving prints in the damp earth, his laughter a rare melody against the town's quiet. She'd taken to trading her needlework at the general store, her earnings enough for a thin mattress and a sack of flour. The townsfolk still watched, their whispers a low hum, but she held her head high. The cloth Tahoma had given her now a patch on Elias's shirt, a silent thread, connecting her to that first kindness. Tahoma appeared more often now, his presence a steady rhythm in her days. He'd pass by the lean-to with a load of firewood or a bucket from the forge, his dark eyes meeting hers with a nod that carried no demand. Once, he left a handful of dried berries beside her basket, their tart scent mingling with the fabric's mustiness. She'd murmured thanks, her voice soft, and he'd tipped his hat, saying only, "Good for the little one." He never asked about her past, never lingered on the town's gossip. His focus stayed on the present, on the strength she showed in each stitch. One afternoon, as she sat mending by the stable, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. The sun caught the lines of his face, weathered yet gentle, and he watched Elias play with a stick. "You teach him well," he said, his tone even, the words settling between them like a shared breath. She glanced up, surprised by the weight of the compliment, her fingers stilling on the needle. "He learns from watching," she replied, her voice low, carrying the subtext of her own survival. Tahoma nodded, as if understanding more than she'd said, then moved on, leaving the air charged with an unspoken thread. The connection grew in these small exchanges, the rustle of fabric, the crunch of his boots, the silence that spoke louder than words. She found herself looking for him, his steady presence, a contrast to the town's coldness. The mud under her boots felt less isolating, the spring air a hint of thaw, mirroring the slow warming within her. Tahoma saw her not as barren or ruined, but as a woman building a life. And in his quiet respect and affection began to root, tentative yet true. The summer sun hung heavy over Willow Creek, its warmth coaxing wildflowers to bloom. Along the creek bank, their faint sweetness drifting on the breeze. Eliza sat beneath the lean-to's overhang, her hands shaping dough on a makeshift table, the scent of yeast and flour filling the air. Elias played nearby, stacking pebbles into a wobbly tower, his giggles blending with the hum of insects. She'd traded her mending for a sack of meal, and today she kneaded with care, her fingers pressing into the soft mass, a rare moment of peace amid the town's lingering judgment. The cloth Tahoma had given her now lined a small basket, a silent tribute to his kindness that she decided to bake a tart. The fruit from the berries he'd left her weeks ago now softened and ripe. The process was slow, deliberate, trolling the dough, pressing it into a tin, layering the berries with a sprinkle of sugar she'd saved. It was a risk, this offering, a piece of herself wrapped in the warm crust, but she felt the urge to give back, to acknowledge the quiet bond forming. When the tart cooled, its golden surface glistening, she wrapped it in a clean cloth and set it aside, her heart beating a little faster. Later, as Tahoma passed with a load of firewood, she stepped forward, the basket in her hands. "Made this," she said, her voice soft, offering it to him. He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers, and took the basket with a nod, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a touch that lingered like a whisper. He unwrapped the cloth, the tart's aroma rising, and a faint smile curved his lips. "Looks good," he said, his tone warm yet restrained, and he broke off a piece, eating it slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. No words of gratitude spilled out, but the way he savored it, the quiet appreciation in his eyes, spoke volumes. He left the basket with her, a silent promise to return it, and walked away, the firewood balanced on his shoulder. Eliza watched him go, the warmth of the gesture settling into her chest. The tart, a symbol of her vulnerability, had been met with silent warmth, deepening the thread between them. The summer air felt lighter, the flowers along the creek a metaphor for the slow bloom within her, nurtured by respect rather than grand declarations. The autumn fair buzzed with life in Willow Creek, the air thick with the scent of roasted corn and the rustle of leaves falling from the cottonwoods. Eliza moved through the crowd, her hand smoothing the skirt she'd mended with Tahoma's cloth, its sturdy weave a quiet badge of resilience. Elias clung to her hand, his small steps keeping pace with hers, his eyes wide at the stalls of handmade goods and the laughter of children. The town had gathered, men in worn hats bartering livestock, women in bonnets exchanging recipes, and for once, the stares felt less like daggers. She carried a basket of mended shirts to trade, her chin lifted, a quiet dignity in her stride. Tahoma stood near the blacksmith's display, his forged tools laid out with care, his dark hair catching the golden light. He spotted her, and with a subtle nod, he made his way over, the crowd parting as if sensing something unspoken. He carried the basket she'd given him, now holding a small carved wooden horse for Elias. "For him," he said, his voice low, handing it to the boy, who beamed and clutched it tightly. Eliza's breath caught, the gesture simple yet profound, and she murmured, "Thank you," her eyes meeting his with a warmth that mirrored the fading sun. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, some curious, others disapproving. "That Apache with the barren woman," a voice muttered, and a woman nearby clucked her tongue. But Tahoma stood tall beside her, his presence a shield, his gaze steady as he ignored the murmurs. Eliza felt the weight of their judgment, the old label of ruined, tugging at her, yet she held her head high, bolstered by his silent support. They walked together to a stall, trading her shirts for a sack of apples. Their movements synchronized, a quiet partnership unfolding. The fair's noise faded as they paused by the creek, the water glinting under the autumn sky. "They talk," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years, "but I'm learning to let it pass." Tahoma nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Words don't make you," he replied, the subtext clear. Her saw her strength, not her scars. The crowd's whispers lingered, but in that moment, they stood together, a transformation unfolding not in grand defiance, but in the steady courage of their shared silence. The night sky stretched wide over Willow Creek, a blanket of stars piercing the darkness, their light reflecting off the creek's gentle ripples. Eliza sat by a small fire outside the lean-to, the crackle of wood mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. Elias slept inside, wrapped in the quilt she'd pieced together from scraps, its patchwork a testament to her resilience. The air carried a crisp autumn chill, the scent of burning pine filling her lungs as she stared into the flames. Tahoma joined her, his steps quiet, settling beside her with a log to tend the fire. The silence between them was familiar, a space where words weren't needed until tonight. He poked at the fire, the embers flaring briefly, and then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I see you, Eliza, not the talk, not the past, just you." His words hung in the air, simple yet heavy with meaning, his dark eyes meeting hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch. She turned her face to the flames, The warmth a contrast to the chill within her, memories of rejection flickering like shadows. They see a failure, she whispered, her voice trembling. A woman who couldn't give what they wanted. The confession slipped out, raw and unguarded. The weight of her barrenness laid bare. Tahoma shifted closer, the heat of his presence steadying her. "They're blind," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "You've built a life, raised that boy with strength I've rarely seen. That's who you are." His hand rested near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth, a silent invitation. The firelight danced across his face, softening the lines of hardship, and she saw, not pity but admiration. Tears pricked her eyes, and she let them fall. The release a quiet catharsis. After a long moment, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers with a tenderness that spoke of trust, not desire. The kiss was brief, a seal on the intimacy they'd forged, and when he pulled back, he smiled faintly. "You've reminded me what family can be," he said, the words a mirror to her own healing. The stars above seemed brighter, the night less lonely, as the bond between them deepened, rooted in truth and mutual respect. The first light of spring painted Willow Creek in soft greens, the creek swelling with melted snow, its gentle murmur a promise of renewal. Eliza stood outside a small cabin Tahoma had found, a weathered structure on the edge of town, its roof patched, its porch sagging but solid. Her hands brushed against a seedling she'd planted, its tiny leaves trembling in the breeze. The earth cool and rich beneath her fingers. Elias toddled nearby, clutching the wooden horse Tahoma had carved, his laughter blending with the chirp of birds. The lean-to was behind them now, a chapter closed, and this cabin marked a new beginning, built not with haste but with quiet intent. Tahoma emerged from the cabin, his sleeves rolled up, a hammer in hand as he worked on a loose board. He'd offered the place after their night by the fire, his words a proposal wrapped in action rather than rings. "We'll fix it together," he'd said, his voice steady, and she'd nodded, the agreement a silent commitment. Today, they measured a fence line, the wood rough against her palms as she held the posts, his hands guiding hers with a gentleness that spoke of trust. The scent of sawdust mingled with the fresh earth, a sensory thread tying them to this shared labor. Inside, she'd begun a garden patch, the seeds a symbol of growth she'd once thought impossible. Tahoma brought water from the creek, pouring it with care, his eyes meeting hers in a moment of understanding. "This'll feed us," he said, the subtext clear. This was their future, rooted in mutual effort. She smiled, the weight of barren fading as she saw not lack, but abundance in their partnership. The townsfolk's whispers still drifted, but here, with the cabin rising and the garden taking shape, they mattered less. As evening fell, they sat on the porch, the horizon glowing with the last light. "You've given me a home," she said, softly, her voice carrying years of healing. He looked at her, his gaze warm. "You brought it to life," he replied, the words a mirror to her strength. The spring air felt like a thaw, their future a quiet promise etched in wood and soil. The summer sun bathed Willow Creek in a golden glow, the creek sparkling as it wound through the valley, its banks lined with wildflowers nodding in the breeze. Eliza stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands resting on the newly painted rail, the scent of fresh wood and blooming lavender filling the air. Elias played in the yard, the wooden horse in hand, his laughter mingling with the hum of bees. The garden thrived behind her, rows of vegetables and herbs a testament to months of quiet labor. Tahoma emerged from the cabin, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a faint smile on his lips as he joined her. The silence between them a comfortable embrace. They'd held no grand wedding, no fanfare, just a simple vow exchanged by the creek at dawn, witnessed by the rising sun in Elias's wide eyes. The town had murmured, but their union stood firm, built on respect and shared strength. Today, they danced not in a hall, but here, on the porch, a slow sway to the rhythm of the wind. His hand rested lightly on her waist, hers on his shoulder, the touch a quiet celebration of their bond. The fabric of her dress, mended with Tahoma's cloth, brushed against her skin, a symbol of their journey. The horizon stretched wide, the mountains a silent guardian, and Eliza felt a peace she'd long forgotten. "You reminded me who I already was," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of her healing, a nod to the dignity she'd reclaimed. Tahoma's eyes met hers, warm and steady. "And you showed me what home can be," he replied, his voice a mirror to her truth. They stood together, the dance fading into stillness, their hands lingering as the sun dipped low. The cabin glowed in the twilight, a beacon of their shared life, and the world beyond faded into irrelevance. In that shared silence, they found a peace rooted in authenticity, a love that bloomed not from grandeur, but from the courage to begin again.